Welcome to the 1965 Thanksgiving Convocation presented by Religious Council. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Frances Rippey. Mrs. Rippey has her doctorate in 18th century British literature from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. She has been a member of the Ball State faculty for 7 years, and before coming to Ball State, she taught in Texas and Puerto Rico. You may also know her husband, who teaches in the history department here at Ball State. She is the mother of 2 boys, and being a wife, a mother, and a teacher, we feel she is well qualified to speak on the topic, Thanksgiving, Tradition, and the University. Mrs. Rippey.
On my discouraged days, I sometimes tell myself that the prime secret of teaching is to cling tenaciously to a few sure facts, forcing any related topic around to these points, and that the measure of an effective teacher is his ability to get the general topic as quickly and as smoothly as possible onto one of these sure facts, to hold it there with all his might and main till 50 minutes is up. The freshman research paper, I think, is a fairly clear instance of that. I think the biggest stride forward I made in teaching the freshman research paper is to tell the student, you haven't written on the topic, so let's change your topic. That is, you're really doing the early life of Paul. So let's just call your paper The Early Life of the Apostle Paul. And then your treatment fits the topic. When I was asked to give a 35-minute talk on Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving tradition, I was struck by the fact I knew only one thing about it. And I learned that in the 4th grade. And that's that the first Thanksgiving took place in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1621 under the administration of Governor Bradford. So I thought, well, that's not much to build 35 minutes out of, but I'll work at it anyway, as if I can just get to it, if I can narrow it to it fairly fast. An old device we learned in graduate school was whenever we touched on something we didn't really understand, we said, Pope's Roman Catholicism as contradicting his deism is a very interesting topic, but it does not lie within the province of this study. You can get out of an amazing amount of difficult questions in that way. So I decided to narrow it down to this one decisive thing, and after all, nothing is more important than the origin. No, nothing is, but unfortunately, as I started reading up on it a little, the origin is a good deal more complicated than that. There were Chinese Thanksgiving festivals, 3000 BC, but I've eliminated them on the grounds that they aren't directly in the Western tradition, so we cannot talk about anything Mongoloid. Then, unfortunately, even if you say they have to be directly related to Western civilization, it turns out that everybody has a Thanksgiving festival. The Egyptians had one to Osiris. It may center in, as it does in that case, on a male deity, but it's always a vegetation deity. It's always a kind of harvest Thanksgiving festival in which you combine feasting and games and some kind of religious rite. So the Egyptians had Osiris and the Phoenicians had Astarte, always some mother of grains, goddess of grains. The Babylonians had Tammuz, this god which returned from the underworld, again as a vegetation symbol. In Greece, the central deity was female, was Demeter. The Eleusinian mysteries every September centered around celebration of this grain festival. In Rome, it was Ceres, the goddess from whom we get our word cereal. Right? I can eliminate all these by saying, no, I won't take pagans, and they've got to be monotheists. So all of those now we have narrowed out of our consideration. Unfortunately, that always leaves you with a considerable tradition, since it leaves you with the Jews. And the Jews had 2 feasts, which are fundamentally Thanksgiving feasts, a spring one, oddly enough, and a fall one. The spring harvest feast was called the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. It's mentioned in Leviticus. It's set up 50 days after Passover, or specifically from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offerings. It specifies sacrifices, offerings, and ends, and ye shall proclaim on the selfsame day that it may be a holy convocation unto you. You shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. And when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and to the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Then you already have a kind of harvest festival with an emphasis on charity, on a care of the poor, food left for the poor. Then the fall festival is something called Sukkot, or the Feast of the Tabernacles. Again, Old Testament description. Thou shalt observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days. After that thou hast gathered in thy corn and thy wine. And thou shalt rejoice in thy feast, thou and thy son and thy daughter, thy manservant, thy maidservant, and the Levite, the stranger and the fatherless, and the widow that are within thy gates. 7 days shalt thou keep a solemn feast unto the Lord thy God, in the place which the Lord shall choose, because the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thine increase, and in all the works of thine hands. Therefore thou shalt surely rejoice. 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God, in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. Therefore the Jewish festival always involves 2 important things: the joys of the harvest, but a remembrance of the sorrows of the fathers. That's why the tabernacles, that's why the living in tabernacles was to remind the Jewish people there was a time in which they had nothing else to dwell in. But the Jewish rites are unquestionably thanksgiving services in our sense. They center around they involve harvesting, they involve feasting, they tie in with the idea of thanksgiving to God and of a kind of charity to the poor. We can eliminate them only by saying, but they aren't Christian and they aren't European American. So we'll center on just those things, on Christian festivals in Europe and America. By saying Christian, we've eliminated one more. The fact that even in Anglo-Saxon England there were harvest home festivals. There were festivals in which you celebrated the bringing in of the last sheaf of grain, with ceremonies and rejoicing and feasting. Older than Christianity. In the rest of Europe, too. I just know more about the Anglo-Saxons. But as soon as you have Christianity, you have, again, a kind of thanksgiving. If you say grace before meat, it's a thanksgiving. The word grace, which was always in Elizabethan England through Chaucer and up through Shakespeare, graces before meal, is just your word thank you. It's like the Spanish gracias. But we can eliminate grace by saying, no, it must be a special day. It must be a whole day in the fall, set aside for celebration. In that sense, there is not a Thanksgiving Christian ceremonial in Europe until the High Middle Ages. Then it almost always is the Feast of St. Martin of Tours, what we call Martinmas, the November 11th feast. Started out with Mass, then there were games and dances and parades, and finally a festive dinner which always centered around a roast goose. There was St. Martin's wine served. It was the first wine you had made from this year's crop of grapes and was part of the ceremonial. It's interesting that after the Reformation, although the harvest home still holds on in England, it's not celebrated in the same elaborate detail, but it is in Holland. So your pilgrims had stopped over 1 year and seen the roast goose festival in Holland before they came to America. The Anglican Church did keep a harvest festival. That is, a ceremony in which their altar was piled high with fruits and vegetables. They still do it. You'll go into an English church in the fall, and for one Sunday they've decorated with fruits and vegetables, not with flowers. And it'll be heaped up all around the altar area. Then we can say, no, this is still European. We want to talk about Christian Thanksgiving ceremonies in the United States, or at least in North America. I'm afraid that doesn't quite get us to Governor Bradford yet. It gets us, as my husband keeps reminding me, to Ponce de Leon and his priest, who, as soon as they celebrate Eucharist in Florida, are celebrating Thanksgiving. That's what Eucharist means. That name for the Mass means Thanksgiving. There are particular Catholic ceremonies that were celebrated in the territorial United States long before it was the United States. Every Mass, in a sense, is a Thanksgiving festival, but particularly a Mass with a benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, followed by a Te Deum and a liturgical Mass prayer of Thanksgiving, is a Thanksgiving ceremony. You are having those things in territory that now is United States territory, from Florida clear as far north as Chesapeake Bay, in Spanish missions. And missions are expeditions manned by the Spanish Christians. You're also having them obviously in Albuquerque, and Santa Fe, and St. Augustine. So if it's going to be the earliest Thanksgiving ceremony on American soil involving Christian Europeans and Indians, then those 1,500 ceremonies would actually be it. To work up a little closer in a different area, if you include all of North America, Newfoundland had a set-aside Thanksgiving Day in 1578. Or in 1607, in two different places in the U.S., you're having a Thanksgiving ceremony. A harvest home, an Anglican ceremony in Jamestown in 1607. And a Thanksgiving ceremonial in Maine in August of 1607. I expect that tells you something about Maine climate. If you're going to have one last ceremony before winter sets in, you have it in August. Right, that finally gets us up to Governor Bradford. That is, 14 years later, in December 13th, 1621, there is a Thanksgiving ceremony held. I was right about that at least. By proclamation, 3 days feasting, as a matter of fact, instead of one, involving Christian, white men, and Indians, serving some turkeys, but only because there were not enough geese. The men were sent out to shoot wild geese and came back with some geese and some turkeys. And serving, as you had through the Middle Ages, the St. Martin's wine, the first wine of the season, made from their own grapes. Then out of this background come, it seems to me, three questions worth considering. Why, out of all this wealth of Thanksgiving ceremonial, do we center on Bradford and Massachusetts Bay in 1621? Second, and much more important, what is so universal about the ceremonial that both the Chinese and the Jews and the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and modern Christian Americans would celebrate it in very much the same manner, a similar manner? And if it is universal, then what particular relevance does it have to the university? And finally, a kind of gloomy question, but one always worth considering when you're contemplating any institution: what seeds does it have within it of its own destruction? That is, if it were to turn into something less than admirable, what would it likely turn into? But to get back to the first question, why Governor Bradford in 1621? Out of all the possibilities, why not Ponce de Leon, for example? Oh, a number of reasons. The menu is more our menu. We're pretty sure he had turkeys. The evidence is ambiguous. So you could say on the basis of menu, he's closer. But that's hardly binding. As somebody in literature, I would be tempted to say to you, because Governor Bradford was smart enough to have somebody literary write it down, so that what we keep reading over and over is Edward Winslow's account of the first Thanksgiving. Don't mean he's a professional literary man, but he's somebody who is interested in recording in words this thing. We only peripherally know about Ponce de Leon's. And besides, it would be in Spanish, and we wouldn't pay much attention to it. But here's a nice English literary account of a Thanksgiving ceremonial, which is very useful. It means something bigger, though. I think it really means that what American historians, fuss about a lot, our assumption that all good things come out of New England, an assumption that still lives with us to a considerable extent, because so many good things did. And particularly, again, may I remind you, because most of the literary men of the first 100 years of American history came out of it. Not all. Not Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, who had more European influence than any of the others. But most of them were New Englanders, again, excepting Washington Irving. And the traditions they dealt with were the New England puritanical traditions. I know I was struck when President Johnson was elected that over a national network, a reasonably reputable news commentator said, "And so America has elected its first Southern president." And I thought, well, there goes Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Woodrow Wilson, Andrew Johnson, and Andrew Jackson. But it's still the assumption that nothing good comes out of certain areas, certainly, and that everything good comes out of New England. But I think it lies even deeper than that. I think it means we're still fundamentally romantics. And we like to believe we make things up completely. That is, that nobody had ever had a Thanksgiving before 1621. It came as a full-blown idea to Governor Bradford, who said, we've never heard of this before, but I've thought of a wonderful idea. We'll have a Thanksgiving ceremony. Because we're romantic, we like to think things happen often like that. In fact, we're a little ashamed of being traditional. I was struck so much when I was first here with a meeting of the Ball State faculty wives in which several ladies discussing Christmas would get up and say, "We have started an interesting Christmas tradition in our home." Where I come from, you don't start traditions. You don't consciously say, "This is our tradition from now on." And I suspect you really don't start traditions. You may start a habit, but I'm not at all sure you can ever consciously set up a tradition. Like a good many other things, they have to grow out of some other things. But as educators, I think we often fall into that. We feel that a student hasn't been educated unless he's been deracinated, unless he's been uprooted. And that the only sure sign we have that we've moved him is for him to go out of the university entirely different from the way he came in, literally different. So that we act as if sometimes we take statistical studies and we find out that most students who come in Republican go out Republican. And most students who come in, Northern Baptist go out Northern Baptist. And on the basis of those studies, we say we aren't touching them enough. As if what we really wanted to do was take every Republican pre-med Roman Catholic, and by the time we'd finished him 4 years later, having, a Democratic Presbyterian lawyer, something entirely different from the way he'd started out, then we would have changed him. We don't at all trust the fact that he might choose his tradition and choose the same one he grew up in, but more intelligently. T.S. Eliot, writing in an essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent, said, "Tradition cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence, a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his own contemporaneity, of the world immediately about him. We act as if the fact that Bradford said, "Let's have one more Thanksgiving," even here, was no achievement at all. And yet it seems to me that's a tremendous achievement. We forget that tradition, and this is what Eliot is saying, tradition doesn't live easily. It can always be killed, very simply. All you have to do is not act, and it dies. And if you will not act for a generation, it's gone. So that it perhaps takes a little more effort to maintain a tradition than is originally thought. That is, for a group of pilgrims in a new world to say, it's been a bitter experience, but all the same, let's have another Thanksgiving festival, is, it seems to me, a considerable act of the will. The alternative, that is, to stay on rationed food, which they were on most of the time, must have been fairly tempting, as a matter of fact. Nothing reminds you of how easily, again, a tradition dies as teaching the ballad. I used to teach it when I was at Vanderbilt, taught it in Tennessee. And I would have students whose immediate parents were very fashionable Nashvillians. The students would come up and say to me after class, I know a version of Lord Randall, but he's not called Lord Randall, he's just called Young Randall. And he doesn't die from eating this poisoned fish, say. He dies from eating eels boiled in brew. And I'd say to them, write it down, because you might really have a variant that child never collected, so write it down while you know it. And I never had a student who really could. They would always say, I don't remember the words very well. I just remembered when we read it, I remembered I'd heard it. And I'd say, who taught it to you? It was always my grandmother, not my mother, who's very busy acting as if she's never heard of Lord Randall and has almost convinced herself. But my grandmother, and she's dead, the boy would say. So that it means always that tradition was dying. We say about the ballad, it could survive anything but literacy. But when you taught people to read and write, then it dies out. They no longer need the kind of memory that carries around a ballad verbatim in their heads. And they no longer are interested in it. By the time they find out, as they did at Vanderbilt, that the ballad is a very fashionable thing to know, a very sophisticated thing, then they're one generation too late. You've lost it already. Finally, the question about the universality or the particularity of a Thanksgiving festival. Why is it universal? It's plain that we are no longer a rural society. If it is only a harvest festival, then to 9 out of 10 of us it is not immediately relevant. But it's always struck me that there's a fairly close parallel between the student and the farmer, much closer than between, say, the student and, the accountant. They both work in a complicated and risky fashion with materials, the earth or the mind, which they did not make, which they cannot take the basic credit for, which they can destroy but not create. So it seems to me that the student is in a particularly parallel position to the farmer who celebrates the bringing in of the first fruits. Why is it universal? Then what relevance does it have to us in our particular situation? One thing, it reminds us what it reminded the Jews, that things could go and have gone otherwise. That is, it isn't all an optimistic festival. What you're being thankful for is always partly perils escaped, dangers circumvented. And it is well to remind ourselves of the alternatives. The introduction mentioned our 2 children. Since we're college professors, of course, the first thing we do when we know we have a child on the way is read a lot of books. And the first thing we do, of course, is read all the books for expectant parents, which are very cheerful, which keep saying 7 children out of 8 are perfectly normal. And you always think, but 1 in 8 is terrible odds, much worse than I'd thought. But then, having run out of them, we went through the embryology section of the Ball State Library. And it's much a different thing. That is, the embryologist is not writing for expectant mothers. So he's saying, and another terrible thing that can happen in the 5th week is, and then, with pictures and diagrams and graphic descriptions. And I think, of course, the more we read, the more we worried, always. and the birth of the child, who it seems miraculously, who converts to breathing, although his lungs haven't worked, and who has the proper number of fingers and toes and is reasonably sensible, seems miraculous, seems a moving miracle. I think one of the things I like best about the Episcopal Church is that it has a service of thanksgiving for women after childbirth, in which it says in part, O Almighty God, we give thee humble thanks for that thou hast been graciously pleased to preserve through the great pain and peril of childbirth this woman thy servant, who desireth now to offer her praise and thanksgiving unto thee. And it seems to me that's an eminently sensible statement. That is, what it does is acknowledge the alternatives. Not that could happen to me, but to the baby. And say, think of what the odds were, and yet it came out all right. And I think that's part of what Thanksgiving says. It could have been so different. Thank heaven it isn't, you're saying. Then a related idea, universally, it makes it very plain that what we want is mercy, not justice. That is, except in a very perfunctory fashion, you do not thank people for things which they owe to you when they pay it back. But I think you thank them very gratefully for things they didn't owe you, which they give you anyway, although you don't deserve them. And I think that's a good deal of the point of Thanksgiving. At a point in Hamlet, when the actors have come in, Hamlet says to Polonius, treat them well, treat them gently. And Polonius says, missing as he always does the point, my lord, I will use them according to their desert. And Hamlet turns to him and says, God's bodikins, man, much better. Use every man after his desert, and who should scape whipping? That is, I want you to treat them well, he says, not just as they deserve to be treated. And part of what the Thanksgiving ceremonial says is thank you for treating me well, rather than in the way I deserve to be treated, rather than whipping me. Finally, for the student, as for the farmer, Thanksgiving stresses our very complicated dependence upon other people and other forces. It's true of the farmer, it's true of the student. The mind which makes it possible for him to study in college, he did not create. It was, in a sense, with him from the moment of conception. He can choose not to use it, and he has the negative choice always, but he didn't create that capacity. He is partly the product of books, of course, of men who've been dead a long time. But he is mainly the product of people. In all my teaching career, I have probably dealt only with 3 or 4 students who literally came to college in spite of everybody, in spite of family, in spite of friends, in spite of professors, former professors. It takes a tremendous amount of character that most people don't have, that I wouldn't have had. Every student I talk to is in college partly because of somebody, a parent, somebody they worked with, a teacher, who made the difference, who made the decisive difference. I'm sure I'm a PhD in English, partly because after my mother and father put my sister and me to bed, what they did for fun, for recreation, with great relief, a relief I didn't fully appreciate till I had my own children, was read to each other. My father was a tax attorney. He wasn't a literary man. But what they read to each other were, everything. Kristen Lavrenstatter. I suppose at the age of 6, I had heard every 3rd page, before I went to sleep, of, that 1,200-page Scandinavian novel, which they'd read back and forth, chapter by chapter. Paul de Kruif books. They were great admirers of, and read each other in tremendous detail. I couldn't tell you a thing about bacteriology now. But I learned from them that books are delightful, that they're the things you turn to with relief and pleasure when you get the children to bed. And I'm sure on me. I'm here partly because of a 6th grade teacher named Flossie Green, who grading, 30 workbooks, and I had no idea what that meant now. as I do now. But she said at the end of mine, you know, with your vocabulary, you can do anything you like in literature. I've always meant to go back and tell her it was a little harder than she'd led me to believe. But all the same, you know, that one sentence, which took her 30 seconds to write, I think was fairly decisive. A man and a woman who taught me at TCU, and a couple of men at Vanderbilt, and a man at the University of London, in very different ways, taught me that the academic discipline could be an exciting one in a kind of enchanting world, something I've never forgotten. So that I, like 99 students out of 100, am largely the product of other people. And whatever degree of success I attain will be because of a number of people who at decisive moments were helpful. It's always a very complicated business when you're dealing with the human mind, because you just don't ever know quite the degree to which you are influencing somebody, and not always the direction, I'm sure. Miss Green did not realize I'd remember 25 years later what she put at the end of my workbook, but I do. It's true in another sense, too, as a student, in a less cheerful sense. Every success you attain as a student is in a way at the price of a great many other people. For example, I've never had a scholarship that somebody else deserving couldn't have used. In a sense, didn't need more than I needed. I went to England on a Fulbright, and I knew some people who would have given, 10 years of their life to do it, and were extremely deserving. Could not have done it without the scholarship and didn't get it. I hold a job now, which I'm sure other people would like. So that every success I have has been in a way at somebody else's expense. It's true even personally. I'm married to a man that would have made somebody else a splendid husband if I hadn't seen it and moved fast, And again, I think you have to, part of what you're saying at Thanksgiving is that's a considerable debt. Then I better make some good use of these things that have been given me. Right, finally, briefly, the dangers. We said every institution carries in itself the potential seeds of its own destruction. In the marked Arthur in Tennyson's Idylls of the King, Arthur is dying and Bedivere is weeping beside him, and Arthur says to him, "Don't weep." Although this means, as they all know, the dissolution of the Round Table. It's like the end of Camelot. But he says, "Don't weep. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world." Which is, I think, one of the wisest and most complicated single lines Tennyson ever wrote. Then, what is the danger inherent in a Thanksgiving ceremony? Not, I think, secularism, though we frequently say it is. Part of what I've been trying to say is it's always been a secular festival. It started out secular. It has always involved feasts and games as well as a religious observance. What we're giving thanks for is a series of secular blessings. A child is, in one sense at least, a secular blessing, a flesh and blood blessing. Food certainly is. Clothing certainly is. Thanksgiving is by its very nature perhaps the most secular of all religious festivals. So I don't think it's secularism really it has to worry about. I think it's what the Greeks called hubris. A wise teacher of mine once said, when pushed on exactly what it is, hubris is what, when you get it, nemesis happens to you. And it's true enough. It's an overweening pride, an arrogant boastfulness that the Greek said is the step before tragedy. And Thanksgiving, oddly enough, can turn into that. We've said it's based on humility. It's based on saying, thank you for mercy instead of justice. But it's just a step away from saying, look how splendid we are. From pointing out to the Almighty your accomplishments of the previous year. One of the stories in the Bible, in the New Testament, which makes perfectly plain Jesus' position on someone he does not care for, is a story about a man who goes to church and delivers a prayer of thanksgiving. It's that Pharisee, you remember, who prays and says, God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week and I give tithes of all I possess. And Jesus said he did not go away justified. He is one who had better not have been in church on Saturday. That is, he's worse off at the end than at the beginning. All right, in university terms, that means if we educate you 4 years and you say upon graduation, thank God I'm not like the dropouts, I think you're on very dangerous ground. If you mean I'm financially much better off, sure, I'm not going to argue with you about that. But if you mean I'm morally superior, then I think we've created a Frankenstein monster. That particular kind of intellectual snobbery is the mark of the half-educated man. And it's pretty scary. And you encounter it. You encounter the feeling that college is a mark of virtue rather than of, say, wisdom. I'm always reminded, and it makes, I think, a useful closing quotation of a Kipling poem. It was the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. She had been on the English throne 60 years in 1897, and the English were having what started out as a Thanksgiving celebration, thankfulness for 60 years of reign under a good woman. But what it turned into almost immediately, as this thing turns under our hands sometimes, was again a mutual self-congratulation in which Englishmen reassured themselves, each other, that they were very fortunate to have been English rather than one of the lesser breeds. How splendid it was to be an Englishman. How kind it was of God to single them out for his special favor. And Kipling worried about it. It's interesting that Kipling worried, since he was not innocent of rattling swords and waving Union Jacks from time to time himself. But it finally bothered him enough that he said, I am going to try to write a poem to keep the evil eye off England, which is talking specifically about this hubris business, to remind the English that that kind of boastful arrogance goes before a fall, he said. And he wrote one that's in most hymn books called Recessional. That is, it's the hymn you leave by, but he means that on more levels than one, in which he tried to remind Englishmen that it's fine to be grateful, but to remember what to be grateful for, which is never your own tremendous superiority to other men.